On June 12, 1976, the body of 70-year-old Blanche Kimball was discovered in her home in Augusta, Maine. She had been savagely stabbed to death and was lying in a pool of her own blood. Worried neighbors had called the police because they hadn't seen the pleasant old lady in quite a while. They had been concerned that she had been killed so brutally. Those who knew her said she was always there to lend a helping hand, whether it be for friends, family, or even neighbors. In 1976, Blanche Kimball, then 70 years old, resided in Augusta, Maine. Her parents, Elliot and Fanny Bell, had raised her in Albany. Blanche never got married and has no kids. Blanche was born into a tiny household and lost her sister in 1916. Blanche lived on State Street, a 4-lane street that is now bordered by either side by a few apartment buildings. She had a half-sister who was born when she was 10 years old, 2 aunts, and a few cousins who lived out of state in the 1970s. Blanche had also retired for 3 years from her position as a dental technician and practical nurse at the Veterans Administration Center in Toga. According to the Kennebec Journal, Blanche Kimball lived in a sizable 2-story wooden frame house. However, the house has long since been leveled, and now the area has been turned into a parking lot. With neighbors keeping an eye on Blanche's comings and goings, they noticed in the middle of June 1976, a tired woman who lived next door hadn't been seen for days, possibly even weeks. Blanche was living alone in that large house in 1976, but she had occasionally rented out rooms to transient boarders in the past. It was over Memorial Day weekend when Blanche Kimball was last seen. On June 12, 1976, Detective Sergeant Carol Clement of the Augusta Police Department knocked on the door of 352 State Street to check on Blanche. He repeated the sequence several times, but each time he was met with silence. He then wiggled the knob to see if it had been left unlocked, in case Blanche hadn't entered or exited her home in nearly 2 weeks. Finally, concerned neighbors called the police to do a welfare check on their elderly neighbor. Since Gary Robert Wilson was a drifter and new to the area, Blanche offered him the room and some food at no cost, covering all of his expenses herself. During his brief stay with Blanche, it became increasingly clear to the neighbors that this man was a shifty character and a troublemaker. Gary was only 27 years old, so there was a significant age gap between them. Blanche had a slightly different viewpoint. She really thought that by assisting in getting to know this stranger, she would be better able to understand his own behavior. Given that she led a solitary and quiet life, she was happy to have the company. The neighbors weren't surprised because it turned out she had done something similar before. Nobody made a big deal out of Blanche's kindness because, after all, it seemed to make the older woman happy to help, even though they didn't say anything about it. When police went looking for Gary Wilson, the only suspect, he was nowhere to be found. He had left no evidence behind him when he left the area several days earlier, and no amount of searching could locate him because he had no real ties to the area and there was nothing in the house that could connect him to the actual crime. Even the weapon used to kill Blanche was missing, despite the fact that forensic experts had stripped the house bare and had nearly examined every nook and cranny of the building. 3 days later, after Blanche was discovered dead in her home, investigators thought they had finally gotten a break when Gary Wilson was seen breaking into a nearby home. Police were immediately dispatched to the area, but he managed to escape again and fled the city. By the time both state and local police were involved in the case, they continued their investigation and spoke to a large number of additional witnesses. But alas, they found no leads. Seattle, Washington is the setting of our tale. Pike Place Market and the Space Needle are 2 of Seattle's well-known monuments. Seattle is noted for being the home of several big technology businesses, the origin of grunge music, and the capital of coffee. The transient population was swarming the streets of Seattle in 2010 when 2 homeless men got into a fight on a street corner. The argument was loud and attracted the attention of many onlookers, and at one point during the argument, one of the men brandished a knife. Seattle is also known as the Emerald City for its abundance of greenery and mouth-watering cuisine, beers, and wines. Police were called by witnesses, and they promptly arrived at the site. Because the victim was never found, no formal charges were brought against Mr. Robb, and he was released. Police confiscated his knife in an effort to identify the other male involved in the fight, and the knife was taken to a forensic lab. One of the men fled the scene, while the man with the knife was detained and brought in for questioning at the station. When the man was asked his name, he responded to Mr. Robb, adding that he had pulled the knife out on the other man out of self-defense. Investigators were able to identify that this was in fact the knife that 70-year-old Blanche had been viciously killed with years earlier. When they made this realization, they understood that Mr. Robb was actually Gary Robb. Two different types of blood were discovered on the knife, one of which was recent and came from the still unidentified male victim that evening. The other, however, was 34 years old and belonged to none other than Blanche Kimball, whose case by that time had been cold for decades. Someone would have to come up with a technique to gather DNA from a man who was practically a ghost before a feasible plan of action could be formed to prosecute Gary. This would have to be done before a viable plan of action to prosecute Gary could be developed. The Seattle Police Department began looking for Gary in the neighborhood because, given the magnitude of the city and the level of activity within it, it was highly improbable that they would find him elsewhere. Both the Maine State Police Department and the Seattle State Police Department appeared to be at a loss for ideas regarding how to collect this evidence. Despite this, the Maine State Police Department had sought a DNA sample from the Seattle State Police Department. In order to collect a DNA sample, one undercover agent made the decision that as soon as he was able to locate Gary, he would employ all of his craftiness in order to trick Gary into giving it to him. The idea was easy yet ingenious. After days of looking, he finally identified Gary, and knowing Gary's weakness for quick cash, he offered to pay him to take part in a chewing gum survey. Gary agreed to do the survey since he was interested in earning fast cash. It should come as no surprise that this was all a ploy. He pretended that the purpose of the poll was to evaluate a new brand of chewing gum. Gary Robert Wilson, who was 63 years old when Blanche was murdered, was amazingly connected to the crime because of the DNA that was obtained from the chewing gum. Gary was able to evade punishment for an additional 2 years after his DNA was found to have a positive match, until he was finally captured on October of 2012. Robb, who served in Vietnam and was a war prisoner at one point, accepted his culpability despite insisting that he had no memory of the incident in question. He was given a sentence of 20 years in prison, but he passed away in a prison hospital just 2 years into his sentence. As the oldest unsolved homicide in Maine that led to a charge, the case received a lot of attention from national media outlets. The investigation into the death of Blanche Kimball provided a glimmer of hope to family members and friends of victims around the country whose crimes have never been solved. One thing that we need to keep in mind is that justice will eventually always win. Several of the people who lived nearby and relatives of the family had just reached their teenage years at the time that Blanche was killed. However, they were still around to hear the news that Gary had been arrested. Their parents were the first who told them about Blanche's willingness to serve others and all about her generous attitude. What do you think about the way this case was resolved? Do you believe that using a little deception to find a killer is justified? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications before leaving. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.